Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Rabb, and I have the enormous honor of serving as president of Hunter College, where the American dream continues to come true. Today, I have the great privilege of welcoming you all to a special Roosevelt House gathering, a town hall event to address, as best as we can, the dire and devastating situation unfolding in Ukraine. As the city's most diverse college, Hunter is proud to serve as the educational home for students, staff, and faculty from all across the globe, including many from the region now faced with unspeakable horrors and atrocities, several of whom I am pleased to welcome here today. Our thoughts and our prayers are with you. Our admiration for your courage and resilience is boundless, and we join with you today in solidarity for democracy and with the hope for a much better future. We have some extraordinary and deeply experienced people to speak with you this afternoon. But first, I want to spotlight a special guest from the city, the Commissioner of Immigrant Affairs, Manuel Castro, who, along with the mayor, has stepped up efforts to extend humanitarian relief and refuge for those fleeing Ukraine in search of a place to restart their lives and, of course, their educations. Commissioner Castro, thank you for being with us, and please rely on Hunter for anything we can do to support your efforts. From the Hunter College Slavic Studies Program faculty, I welcome and thank Jascha Klotz, whose most recent book is Poets in New York on City Language Diaspora. His latest research examines the circulation, reception, and first publications of manuscripts from the Soviet Union in the West. And I know Professor Klotz has been very involved in our efforts to highlight the atrocities in the Ukraine and to create a response from Hunter College. Thank you, Jascha. We are also pleased to welcome our Professor Elidor Mihili, Professor of History and Public Policy, whose work focuses on dictatorships, authoritarian regimes, and the diplomatic, economic, political, and cultural dimensions of the Cold War. His books include From Stalin to Mao, Albania and the Socialist World. Based on 8 years of research in Tirana, Berlin, London, Moscow, Prague, Rome, Washington, New York, and Palo Alto, the book was featured on the BBC and Voice of America. Professor Mihili is also a leader on our Humanity in Action program and has helped our students experience life in Europe and promote social and economic exchange. Katja Soljak is a filmmaker, journalist, and the editorial director of Forbes Media International Editions. Her film about Ukrainian history and identity, The Long Breakup, has been featured in screenings across the city and around the world, and she has written extensively for national media outlets about growing up in the Soviet Union. Finally, it's my pleasure to welcome my colleague, Dr. Lev Svirdov, who does a masterful job of directing our Macaulay Honors College at Hunter College. A Rhodes Scholar, Lev's family is from the Ukraine-Russia region, and we are so glad to have him here with us to share his personal perspective on the war. We welcome also our students in the audience. We know you too will make your voices heard during this urgent and critical time together. While our hearts sink for the people of Ukraine, we are inspired by their commitment to freedom and their fight for a vision of a better tomorrow. As we watch the news in awe of the courage of the Ukrainian people, we cannot help but be reminded of our historic Hunter motto that they so deeply embodied, Mihi Kura Futuri, the care of the future is mine. With that, please enjoy a brief video montage before the program is handed to the Director of Roosevelt House Public Policy Program, Dr. Basil Smikey, and Director of the Roosevelt House Human Rights Program, Jessica Neuwirth. Thank you all for being with us, and thank you for all your efforts to address this devastating situation in the world. And Slava Ukraini!
have seen in one of those slides, the poster, "We need your help, world." Welcome to Roosevelt House for this town hall on Ukraine, an opportunity for all of us to listen, learn, and speak out. My name is Jessica Neuwirth, and I am the director of the Human Rights Program. I'm very pleased to co-moderate today with Basil Smikle, director of the Public Policy Program at Roosevelt House. And we want to thank Hunter College President Jennifer Rabb for sponsoring this event, as well as Harold Holzer, who's with us today, the director of Roosevelt House. Our team pulled this together on very short notice in response to the urgency of this crisis, and I want to thank Katrina Avila, Mac Barrett, Aaron Feynman, Peter Sclafani, and Danny Culkin, who put together the moving slideshow that we saw. Every night, like many of you, I go home and watch the news with ever-increasing horror over the brutality and destruction that the Russian invasion is inflicting on Ukraine. Its people, their homes, hospitals, bridges, power plants, violent and mass destruction. And every time I watch the news, I am ever more deeply moved by the resistance and courage of the Ukrainian people. David holding off Goliath through sheer determination. So many lives have been lost and so many people have been displaced. More than 3 million Ukrainians, women, children, and the elderly, have left their homes and their country. We see them on the news just weeping as they share their devastation with us. We also see on the news amazing acts of resistance, both in Ukraine and in Russia. You may have seen the other day a woman unfurling a banner on Russian national television calling for an end to the war, a brave act that reached millions of Russian citizens. Across that country, there are demonstrations, and many Russians are being arrested for their protest. The media has been censored, and yet the demonstrations continue. All of this is somewhat overwhelming. Today, we're going to hear from experts on the political, humanitarian, and national identity issues swirling around this conflict. Military aid is being sent to Ukraine, sanctions are being imposed on Russia, and the International Criminal Court has begun an investigation into war crimes. What can we hope for from these international responses? What more can we do? We will talk about all of that today. And while we talk about Ukraine, which has dominated the news, let's not forget about Afghanistan and the many other political and humanitarian crises that are still raging, even though we no longer hear about them on the news. As President Zelensky said this morning when he spoke by video to Congress, today it is not enough to be the leader of a nation. Peace in your country doesn't depend anymore only on you or your people. We are increasingly linked across borders and continents, and ultimately we will rise or fall together. Hopefully rise. I want to just take a minute for those of you who may not have seen President Zelensky's speech to Congress this morning to just show you the last portion of that because we found it very moving.
Today it's not enough to be the leader of the nation. Today it takes to be the leader of the world. Being the leader of the world means to be the leader of peace. Peace in your country doesn't depend anymore only on you and your people. It depends on those next to you, on those who are strong. Strong doesn't mean weak. Strong is brave and ready to fight for the life of his citizens and citizens of the world, for human rights, for freedom, for the right to live decently and to die when your time comes, and not when it's wanted by someone else, by your neighbor. Today, the Ukrainian people are defending not only Ukraine, we are fighting for the values of Europe and the world, sacrificing our lives in the name of the future. That's why today the American people are helping not just Ukraine, but Europe and the world to keep the planet alive, to keep justice in history. Now I'm almost 45 years old. Today my age stopped when the hearts of more than 100 children stopped beating. I see no sense in life if it cannot stop the death. And this is my main mission as the leader of my people, great Ukrainians. And as the leader of my nation, I'm addressing the President Biden. You are the leader of the nation, of your great nation. I wish you to be the leader of the world. Being the leader of the world means to be the leader of peace. Thank you. Slava Ukraini.
President Raab has already introduced everyone, so we're going to start our discussion with Professor Elidor Mihili, who will talk about the political backdrop to this crisis. And after his remarks, we're going to open the mic for your questions, comments, and discussion. We'll then talk about humanitarian aid and refugee crisis, and finally we'll talk about some of the underlying questions around Ukrainian identity. In each case, we'll open the floor for questions, comments, and discussions. So let's begin, Professor Mihili. We look forward to hearing your thoughts. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by expressing my gratitude to the Roosevelt House for this event and on this important occasion, and to all of you. It's important to show that we care and that we're here, and so I think the interest that our Hunter community has shown about this event speaks for itself. So I like to begin with the acknowledgement that it's impossible to do the context in 10 minutes, and I'm not going to try to do it because it would be a failure. But I'd like to just make a few broad points, and I'd like to begin with something that might seem obvious. But in light of the slideshow that we saw at the beginning, and especially in light of the speech that that Zelensky gave today, is something that it might not be as obvious as it seems, which is to say that we want to keep Ukrainians at the center of the way we frame what's happening right now. It might seem obvious today, but it may not be obvious in 3 weeks, or in 2 months, or in 6 months, or next year. If this is going to be truly a conflict that will have repercussions over the midterm and the long term, it's going to be important for us to think a little bit about what kind of work we need to do to maintain that kind of momentum, to maintain that kind of attention, and to not let the center of our attention shift away from Ukrainians. There's going to be a lot of pressure to do that, to kind of shift the attention away, particularly as we've sort of become accustomed to this new reality. As human beings, we kind of accustom ourselves to a new reality, and authoritarian leaders rely on that. It's a skill that helps us exist and live and survive, but it's also something that we want to think a little bit about resisting. The new reality that the president of Russia may want to make a permanent one might involve a lot of people having to figure out how to survive in it, but intellectually we want to challenge that. Let me just make it a little bit more concrete. Here in the history department, I teach a course, and as it happened coincidentally, we were dealing with the Cold War right as this assault against Ukraine happened. So a lot of the students had questions about what's happening right now. And a lot of the questions that they had was because the president of Russia was using history. To justify this aggression, to justify this unprovoked aggression, he was making an historical argument. And the historical argument was, this is a place that should not exist outside of the wishes of Moscow, outside of what Moscow wants it to be. We know that's not true. The fact is that this place has existed for 30 years as an independent state. That's a fact. That's not open to interpretation. So when we make Ukrainians, but I would say when we make other people too agents in the history, we kind of are challenging ourselves to ask different questions. When we tell the history of the 20th century from the perspective of Poles, from the perspective of the Baltics, from the perspective of Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia and Bosnia, this is an invitation to sort of decenter ourselves a little bit, and by selves I mean Americans, right? We all have a tendency sometimes to put ourselves at the center and to kind of create a narrative of the world around us. And I think a lot of people in these places are inviting us to kind of decenter ourselves in some ways. But then, of course, Zelensky is making the salient point in that speech that if we're going to talk about peace, we then have to center ourselves in what that means and what the solution might be. The second point is when we take Ukrainians seriously, when we make them agents in their own history, when we make them agents in their own vision of the future, we also sort of see how this is not about legitimate security interests. This is a kind of talking point that the Russian president has used a lot in his commentary over the last 2 to 3 weeks. But we don't want to take that at face value, right? So we need to distinguish between the personalist aspect of that regime and Russia. Russia, the people, the language, the culture cannot be sort of made synonymous with Putin's own interests, with the personalist aspect of that regime. And once we start to disassociate those two, we understand that what might be threatening to Putin is not necessarily a security threat to Russia. That is specifically him in making that argument that views Ukraine as a sphere of influence, as a kind of a security threat. He wants us to operate in a particular space. And so by taking seriously the personalist aspect of the Russian regime, we can kind of push against that narrative as well. And we can go back to history to find ways to counter that narrative. I started with sort of trying to give a little bit in very, very broad strokes, the background to kind of the narrative that the Russian president has used. I wanted to also make the point that one of the stakes, what's really at stake here when we think about where do we go forward, where do we move forward, is something that follows from the 2 points that I've made. I think the Russian president has gambled. He made a bet. I think the bet was that there wouldn't be the kind of mobilization and the kinds of solidarity that we saw very vividly in that presentation, in that slideshow in the beginning. But I think the gamble was also that there would be cynicism, that we're drowning in cynicism in Western Europe, in the United States, in the rest of the world. And that the cynicism is such that we don't really care anymore to distinguish between fact and fiction, that we don't really care anymore to establish solidarity with people who are losing their homes and are being butchered. We can have a discussion a little bit later on whether that was a gamble that was a miscalculated one. It seems to be the case that was a miscalculation, that in fact, unintentionally, when we talk about history in our courses here at Hunter, a lot of times we talk about unintended outcomes, right? That an authoritarian may have a certain approach to a problem, he may even launch a war, but that there are always unintended outcomes, that there's a kind of counter effect, and it immobilizes the other side, it solidifies the other side. And so I think we can make the argument here that there have been a miscalculation, and if we want to kind of take that into a little bit of a more positive direction, we want to insist on non-cynicism. We want to insist on resisting a tendency to kind of take a cynical approach to what happens in the world. The resolve has been heartwarming to see. Now, that doesn't necessarily offer a solution to the problems, but the resolve is definitely something that also should make us feel proud that there has been a pushback. Though, of course, we need to have a discussion about what that might look like, and we are going to in a little bit, and we have some distinguished speakers here who will give us some ideas about that. And finally, let me just point out there's been quite a bit of talk about the misuse of history, the abuse of history. As historians, as students of history, we have, I think, a duty to sort of correct that, to counter that. It's not going to necessarily put an end to the misuse of history. We know that. So I was born in Albania when it was a dictatorship. I grew up in the 1990s. I was in the Balkans. I experienced the death of Bosnia. I was there in the refugee camps where the Albanian community of Kosovo was ethnically cleansed by Serb forces. And back then, in 1999, what you also saw, how difficult it was to make that a central preoccupation in the West. How difficult it was back then. We didn't have social media. We didn't have the various technologies that we have today to make that kind of plight central to Western concerns, right? And one of the things that's been so good to see is, in many ways, that is possible today. So I wanted to leave a kind of a more optimistic note to also point out that we have possibilities that people who suffered 20 or 25 years ago did not have available to them. And so when we kind of want to, we want to do both. We want to do the historical work, we want to correct those narratives, but we also want to kind of have a mobilizational work doing alongside that as well. So I will stop here, and if I welcome your contributions. I started out by saying that we want to center Ukrainian voices, and that's kind of what I want us to also do today. But if you have any questions at all about sort of any of the things I've talked about today, I'd be more than happy to discuss it further.
Thank you so much. If anyone has questions or comments, we'll just take a few minutes. Just head up to the mic. And please identify yourself before you ask a
My name is
question.
Charles Anderson. My question is regarding the history of Ukraine. If you take it back farther, and I'm talking way back when, the way that I see that is Russia comes out of basically Ukraine in terms of their origin, and not what Putin seems to be projecting, which is somehow Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union in Tsarist Russia. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the, quote, original history, if you will, if you can, about Ukraine as an independent state, nation, what have you, going back to the time of the Kiev Rus or whatever it was called back in that time.
Thank you very much for that question. And that's an important one because I think it invites us to think a little bit separately about history and myth-making. Myth-making is very important to nation builders, to autocrats, to powerful people who want to kind of personify a certain destiny for their nation, right? And so the myth building is a very important aspect when we talk about exactly what you have pointed out. But we also want to distinguish that a little bit. There was a very interesting and revealing interview with historian Tim Snyder recently in the New York Times, in one of the podcasts that I'd invite you to sort of, because it's a much longer elaboration on this point about how historians approach those two things as a little bit different. So we want to critically look at the myth building and what that myth is like. But as historians, we also know that it's entirely possible to selectively use different parts of the past. And so one way that I would approach your question is to insist on a kind of pluralist reading of the Ukrainian past. And we can do it through language, we can do it through multiple language, we can do it through cultural life. We have fabulous Ukrainian historians of cultural and artistic life that have handled this question precisely, and they have insisted on sort of precisely countering Putin's point there. So we take it seriously, what he's trying to do, but we do not mistake that as the historical work that we're doing. We want to, the origin story, this is Tim Snyder argument, is mythical. And it's important, it does political work for him. But we know that there is a lot more there and it goes against precisely that point that he's saying.
So can you just give me a little bit of a rundown historically? I mean, back hundreds of years ago, did not Ukraine itself exist well before Russia? And did not, in fact, Russia somehow evolve out of the Ukrainian state? I mean, what is the historical starting point, if you will, as opposed to the point that Putin wants to suggest, which starts more or less in Tsarist Russia?
Yeah, so I'm saying that I'm countering that. I do not agree with that, with the point that this is some sort of origin story. And so when you, for instance, one recommendation that I would have is a book by Serhiy Plokhy, The Gates of Europe, and he gives you there a full account of the Ukrainian, the whole Ukrainian national story. It's a complex story. It's Ukraine has a very complicated story when you go back hundreds of years. Parts of it were culturally much more oriented towards the West, and as we know and as we're seeing today, linguistically, we want to insist also that there's both. It has both. It has many aspects to it. But this account, this simplistic account that Putin says Ukraine has not existed is not true, right? So I'm arguing against that. When he says that Ukraine was a fiction, a Soviet fiction of the 1920s, that Lenin and Stalin discussed, and they kind of like created it out of thin air, that is also incorrect, right? So, how do we know this? We know this because we have Ukrainian historians that have worked, published a lot of books, and done a lot of serious work in showing us precisely that plurality, that pluralism, how people use that in very creative ways to insist on Ukrainianness. And so in order to get that, you'd have to sort of tackle that rich literature.
Let me just invite, just on this history question and political questions, any of the other panelists want to jump in? Love? No? Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague Basil.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jessica. And thank you for your leadership in bringing all of us together for this incredibly important discussion. And thank you as well, Harold and the team at Roosevelt House for bringing all this together. I wanted to use this time to talk about refugees, humanitarian aid, and immigration. So I wanted to address this to Professor Klotz. And after that, I'd like Commissioner Castro to talk a bit about what New York City is doing. And as Jessica mentioned, we've had crises in Afghanistan also, so sort of zoom out a little bit and talk about all the work you're doing with so much going on in the world today. So Professor Klotz, we've heard that this is perhaps the biggest movement of people migrating since World War II. Talk about what's happening today from your vantage point.
Thanks very much. And you just mentioned this context from which I want to start with a somewhat lengthy but somewhat poignant quote. So it starts like this: "How did I get here? What dream wave swept me from the remotest nook of Germany, where I was born and where, after all, I belong, into this auditorium, onto this platform, to stand here as an American speaking to Americans. I am to speak to you today on Germany and the Germans, a risky undertaking, not only because the topic is so complex, but also because of the violent emotions that encompass it today. To deal with it purely psychologically would appear almost immoral in view of the unspeakable that this unfortunate nation has done to the world. Any attempt to arouse sympathy, to defend, to excuse Germany would certainly be an inappropriate undertaking for one of German birth today. To commend himself smugly as the good Germany, in contrast to the wicked, guilty Germany over there, which he has nothing at all in common, that would hardly befit one of German origin. For anyone who was born a German does have something in common with German destiny and German guilt. There are no two Germanys, a good one and a bad one, but only one whose best turned into evil through devilish cunning. For that reason, it is quite impossible for one born there simply to renounce the wicked, guilty Germany." This was Thomas Mann, Nobel Prize laureate for literature, speaking at the Library of Congress on May 29th, 1945. A couple of weeks after the capitulation of Nazi Germany, by extension, a couple of weeks after the end of the Second World War, and less than a year after Mann became a US citizen. We are not there yet, but as someone who was born in Russia and came to the US as a graduate student myself, such as myself, as someone who is now teaching Russian literature here at Hunter, I would like to see a Russian writer saying the same words when this war is over, hopefully not in 6 years. Meanwhile, let's be practical. What can we do here in New York at Hunter in the US? I'm speaking here, of course, not only out of my personal, moral, and professional commitment and obligation to students regardless of their citizenships and backgrounds, nor because, as I said, I was myself privileged enough to have come to the US from Russia as a graduate student, but of course because it is simply impossible not to think of Ukrainian students whose universities are being bombed, nor to ignore what I hear from colleagues who are still teaching at Russian universities in Russia. One of them tells me the other day that 5 out of 30 students or so she has in her class in St. Petersburg at the Stiglitz Academy of Art and Design have already left the country, finding it unbearable, morally unbearable, to remain in the country responsible for this shameful war, a country whose university presidents have expressed their support for the special military operation in Ukraine, a euphemism that is allowed, unlike the word war itself. Several more students in my colleagues' same class have been detained for anti-war protests in Petersburg and are now facing charges for the sole crime. Tens of thousands of students, high school graduates, young people more generally, have left their homes already with a backpack and are now, of course, confused, uprooted, and without any specific plans on how and where to continue their educations. And tragically, we understand that their numbers will only keep growing. So as a university and community that is believed to be the heart of New York City, a city of immigrants, I hope that Hunter and CUNY should give them a chance and might consider doing the following. And when I was writing this or thinking about this, just 2 days ago, I was not yet able, but today I am able to say that I'm very, very happy and extremely proud for Hunter that some of those things are actually already happening and moving. And we will hear more about these initiatives that I nevertheless wanted to list here. Offer extended emergency admission deadlines in order to give our applicants to Hunter and CUNY a chance to join us as freshmen or transfer students in the fall or perhaps even during the summer. Waive application fees, considering that $65, which is, as far as I know, the undergraduate admission fee, is a lot of money for a displaced student. Also consider waiving TOEFL tests, test of English as foreign language requirement, as it may clearly delay application process by months. Expedite I-20s and other paperwork required for these students to apply to US visas. Scheduling a visa interview is in their home countries is, of course, not possible anymore, entailing much longer wait times elsewhere, wherever they are. Apply for temporary protective status or special student relief programs for our students already on campus who come from Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, as well as Syria, and will likely not be able to go back, and they might also need to have a work permit to support themselves while still studying. Offer affordable housing or free housing, even better, at Hunter at CUNY dormitories. And last but not least, launch fundraising campaigns to support admitted displaced students who will, of course, be unable to pay an out-of-state tuition. And our success here will depend, at the end of the day, on the amount of funding raised. But the advantage of CUNY and Hunter is that the same budget will allow us to host several times more students than private universities with much higher tuition rates would. Fundraising can also, of course, be done by individuals and organizations outside Hunter, as long as there is a mechanism in place to apply the funds raised to the student tuitions and costs. So embarking on these initiatives right now will, I'm sure, make Hunter and CUNY stronger as an academic institution and the community, and we will be better prepared to face future crises, much as we wish they should never happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Commissioner, if we could hear from you about New York City's, the work that you are doing in New York City government.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you to Hunter College and my fellow panelists for holding this event and uplifting all the issues that we're discussing here today. My name is Manuel Castro. I'm the Commissioner of the Office of Immigrant Affairs. I was recently appointed by Mayor Adams to serve in this role just 2 months ago. Prior to that, I ran a community organization in Queens, New York, where we served newly arrived immigrants. So I wanted to start there because New York City is a city of immigrants, but just to share some data that some of you might not know of, there are about 3 million immigrants in New York City. That is people who were born outside of the country. That's roughly 40% of New York City's population. When you include the children of immigrants, that goes up to 60%. So when there's a crisis like the one in Ukraine, it is likely that a community here in New York is feeling the crisis, whether it's because they have family, in their home country that are looking to leave or are in imminent danger, or because soon after you will see an influx of immigrants. And so when I was at the community organization, whenever we heard of instability or crisis in any country, whether it was Venezuela or Haiti, we need to prepare for an influx of immigrants. So that is sort of my background. Last couple of years working on these issues, and prior to that, working at the New York Immigration Coalition, working with a variety of different organizations representing the breadth of immigrant representation in New York City and New York State. I come to this role knowing that when there's something going on, that we need to prepare, and we need to be hands-on in preparing for supporting an immigrant community who might be worried for their families and for the possible influx of immigrants. Now, that was the case when the Ukrainian invasion started. I knew that I had to mobilize the team, the staff, and brief the mayor on the possible outcome of this crisis. And I guess my role today is to give you a sense of what New York City is doing, but most importantly, the role that New York City plays in the world, which is very critical. I've been doing a lot of this work with other commissioners, like the Commissioner of International Affairs, of course, commissioners that relate to organizing New York City services for the community as a whole. But immediately, we visited the Ukrainian immigrant or diaspora communities here in New York to hear from them what is it that the needs or the worries were. Immediately, I learned that there were a number of Ukrainian immigrants who were living here undocumented and who perhaps could benefit from temporary or TPS, temporary protective status, as the professor mentioned. Often this status is provided for immigrant communities whose countries are in the middle of a crisis, and allows them to stay here on a temporary basis with legal status, and often this TPS program is extended after the deadline approaches. And so with the New York City Mayor, with Mayor Adams, we began to advocate for the provision of the extension of TPS to the Ukrainian community. We played a significant role in that advocacy, and soon after, the federal administration extended that to the Ukrainian community here. So you see that while we are preparing for a possible influx of refugees or people coming over from Ukraine or the region, New York City also plays a really important role in advocating to the federal government and the United Nations and abroad, advocating for policies and laws that benefit our immigrants community here, but also represent the values that New York City looks to adhere to. I want to end by also reading our list of asks, and this is to the federal government. And I thought it would be interesting to read these to you, since we're in the middle of this type of advocacy. And soon after this conversation, I will be meeting with a US Senator to discuss why is it important for them to do more for the Ukrainian community. So one of our asks, most importantly, is to raise the refugee admissions cap for federal fiscal year 2023, and or offer permanent or temporary humanitarian parole to displaced people seeking refuge in the US, including Ukraine. Should there be a new form of humanitarian relief developed for Ukraine and therefore new arrivals from Ukraine, we ask that the federal funding should be provided at the local and legal services for housing in addition to standard refugee benefits and services. We ask that culturally and linguistically competent outreach about the above, but in the immediate, TPS should be conducted by the federal government, or funding should be provided at the local level to supplement needed outreach. And for those who fled and may try to enter the US border, in general, border process should ensure safety, compliance with human rights norms and US laws, and accessibility for all, regardless of language, family status, disability. Therefore, we ask that the Biden administration end Title 42. Perhaps that was a little bit too into the weeds, but I'm happy to discuss why is it that we're asking for this. And it has to do with current refugee laws as they are. They are complicated to expedite. Often it takes years for refugees to arrive in the country soon after they apply for refugee status. So we are asking the administration to consider other ways for Ukrainian families to bring their family members over. And so hopefully I gave you a sense of what we're doing in terms of advocacy. And of course, we're working with our city agencies across the city to make sure that once the time comes, we're able to provide those services to the community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. Just as I would just add this point, advocacy works tremendously. We just got notice that after President Zelensky's plea to Congress, the Biden administration is giving another $800 million in aid, which brings the amount in over the last few days to $1 billion total. So advocacy does work, and we stand with you, Commissioner. Thank you so very much. Are there any questions for the Professor Klotzer, the Commissioner, at this time before we move on? One question, yes.
My question related to the numbers. A number of the refugees now go to Poland, where Poland is overcrowded, and a lot of them seem to be going possibly to Germany and other places within Europe. Does the United States have a sense as to how many refugees they think are interested in coming to the United States? And more specifically, what about the city of New York? What are those numbers looking like?
So yeah, I had plenty of data, but I didn't want to overwhelm everyone with it. We have an approximate number of Ukrainian immigrants or people with descendant or second generation or third generation Ukrainians here in New York, and it's about 150,000. But that number is complicated because when you add folks who may have overstayed their visas, who might be living here as undocumented immigrants, that number might be more. And so when TPS was extended to Ukrainians, it was believed that about, 25,000, 35,000 people would benefit here in New York. But that number, just this morning, CNN said it could be as much as double that, right? So we're working to figure out what those numbers might look like. But if that's the case, then you can potentially see those that community trying to bring those family members over to New York specifically. The Ukrainian community here is the largest in the country, and so, which is why we have done a lot of advocacy on behalf of the Ukrainian community here. Of course, if there was a refugee program established for Ukrainians, it might be extended to more than just family members of people here.
Thank you.
There are two more questions. Yes, if you could come up to the mic, and if you can make the, and there's one also, right? Yes, just come up to the mic.
Sandra May from Hunter Silverman School of Social Work. I was just wondering that if we do get the allowance for the refugees, what about those people that are on the list already? Is that going to are they going to have to wait longer for that? What's going to be the impact of that? Thank you.
Those are great questions. We're looking to clarify with the federal government, which is why we're holding meetings with elected officials. And we're hoping to be working with the State Department to clarify what a program might look like for family members of folks, who are currently being displaced from Ukraine. If, like I said, if someone is trying to come over through the regular refugee process, this is likely going to take years for them to finally arrive here. So we're looking for alternatives to that. And as my colleagues at the office would say, when we say refugee, that has an actual legal meaning that that carries, I suppose, consequences when you assign someone that, status. And so perhaps we can achieve what we're looking for by other means, by offering perhaps humanitarian parole, which is what I read. Hopefully, we're able to figure something out, because as the professor said, this is the largest displacement of people we've seen since World War II, and I think it merits consideration.
Thank you. Yes.
Hello, my name is Kate, and I'm Ukrainian, and I have all family in Ukraine, and it's on a practice, it's very hard to get your family here. Even I'm legal, I have a green card, I live here, pay taxes, everything. And on a practice, almost 90% they don't give visas to Ukrainians. And the process is also very hard, for example, from the situation that I have with my family. So my sister with the nephew, they want to leave Ukraine and they want to come here, and they need to cross the border because only Poland gives visas. So to have appointment in a visa center, they need to wait up to 2 weeks. And basically, do you have any website who could help to do it more faster? Because basically I live here, I have apartment, they just could come here, but on a practice, she needed to be with a kid 5 years old for 2 weeks in a foreign country just to wait for appointment. And she doesn't have any doubt if they will open visa for her or not. And on a practice, they say that 90% they don't give visas. So it's really hard. She don't want to stay here. She have a beautiful apartment in Kiev. They want to stay on their land. A lot of my friends don't want to leave Ukraine because it's their land, their houses, and they want to live there. But for the time being of the war, it's more safe with the kid to be here, but it's a long process. It's not easy. Maybe you have some website where you could go and make the process not so long and easier. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you for sharing your story and about your situation. Like the professor said, it's important to center, people like yourself and your family who are, living through this crisis. And if this were a public, a community event like the ones I've been attending with the Ukrainian community, I would have shared that New York City has set up a website. It's nyc.gov/Ukrainian resources, which we're constantly updating as we have information about ways to support the community here. We also brought some flyers translated in Ukrainian, Russian, and Polish, and so on. We left some outside. What's important to say, and the reason I described our advocacy is because things are still unclear. And one of the ways we've been supporting community here is by connecting them to their local Congress member who could potentially do something as your federal representative, or the U.S. senators. Senator Schumer has a tremendous amount of power. He's the Speaker of the Senate, and of course Senator Gillibrand. Tom here is our director of legal initiatives, and he's been working quite closely with the team to figure out what might happen, and so we should connect afterwards to see how we might support you. But it is important that the advocacy is important at this point. Speaking with your Congress member, the U.S. Department of State, and as you mentioned, visas have traditionally been difficult to obtain because Ukraine, was not seen as a country, that was stable enough, I suppose, by the United States to offer them that benefit. And so a lot of folks that did get visas and traveled here would overstay their visas. And so that's why you find a number of undocumented Ukrainians here. And so now the folks that do have visas are trying to get here, and if they do get here, they can apply for asylum, right? Or other benefits. And so that's a way. And one other thing that I mentioned, some folks are traveling to the Mexican border and trying to cross over that way and apply for visa.
But I believe it's different. They don't want to live here. They have
I know.
houses. They want to go back to Ukraine.
Yeah.
But when everything will be over, so it's not like political asylum. It's just regular tourist visa, and
Yeah.
it's very sad that it's so hard to get it.
No, we agree. But we're happy to speak with you.
Thank you. Any other questions, or anybody else on the panel want to respond or speak on any of these points? No, and no questions. Thank you. Jessica.
Thank you, Basil. I just want to underscore again what Basil said earlier about advocacy, and it's so heartwarming to see a New York City government official also advocating with the federal government, but that's what we need to think about when we talk about refugee status and all of these other forms of relief. So I just want to say again, we're a strong community. We're in a great place to organize and speak out, and I think we do have powerful senators and representatives, and we should be raising these issues. And sadly, it's not just a Ukrainian issue. It's just, again and again, I think our track record on refugees is really shameful. When you look at other countries much smaller than us, just taking so much more of a burden than we do, and the resources we have, and the history of our own country as a place that is supposed to be a haven for people running away from persecution. So let's move on to our next kind of segment of discussion, which is really about this question that came up a little bit earlier of Ukrainian identity. And I want to ask Katya Soldek to make a few comments. She is the director of a documentary that I highly recommend, The Long Breakup, which really explores these issues from a personal and political point of view. You have the floor.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and for giving me a chance to speak about Ukraine and Ukrainian identity. And I'm happy to be a Ukrainian voice in this panel. And I just want to mention, before I move into the identity subject, that it's very reassuring to hear about these initiatives that are in works, including what Hunter College might be doing or the City of New York, because as you were talking about those things, for me, they have very practical meaning. I know a number of people who could do this or that. My own family right now is stuck in Romania because just like Kate's family, or maybe someone else is here in the audience whose family fled. This is something that just happened to thousands, now almost 3 million of Ukrainians, when people who were doctors, IT professionals, students, artists, just family people, they turned into refugees overnight. They literally had to flee their apartments without thinking too much. There was not much preparation, at least in their minds, for the war. My family is from Kharkiv, Ukraine. It's the eastern side of Ukraine. They were about, I would say, 30 kilometers, so 19, 18 miles away from Russian border. I was informing them from New York, and I work in media, so I'm more, aware of some things about the war for weeks. They just didn't want to hear that because they could not believe. They just lived their lives. They went to work, went to restaurants, to shops, planned vacations, and they just could not believe that Russia and the Putin's government will attack in such a brutal and barbaric way a country that historically has been its closest neighbor. But in general, in 21st century, to start this kind of a war, it was unthinkable. And when on the third day of the war, the tanks were coming into my mother's town. This is my hometown too. I grew up there until I was 20 or something. And the tanks were coming, the military jets were flying, and they reluctantly agreed to jump in the car and started driving. They didn't know where they were going. Kharkiv is all the way to the east. To get to any border, you have to drive literally across Ukraine. So some people would go to Poland, some people would go to Slovakia or Hungary. For them, Romania was closer, so they ended up crossing Moldovan border, and then going to Romania, and now they are in Romania. My stepfather didn't have a visa, so we had to go through the same process. He was able to get a visa, which was not easy, but now he's stuck because they think they lost his passport, and nobody knows when he's going to get his passport, how to get the passport. These are the people who are not super spontaneous. They are losing their minds, and they at least don't have small children to take care of, and they are relatively healthy. My mother was traveling next to the family who were carrying a woman who was in coma. Her family could not leave her behind, so they just put her in a car and they just drove her. And there are so many families and people like that, and they keep leaving because the ones who were more reluctant to leave, they stayed. But when the planes started bombing residential areas and hospitals and universities and landmark in Kharkiv, for some reason Kharkiv became the first and the most vulnerable target. We don't know exactly why. I read in one source a few days ago that it's a personal order by the Russia's President Vladimir Putin. I don't know what to believe, but at this point it was one of the first cities that was destroyed basically during the first week of the war, and today is the 21st day of the war. So people left. Then some people stayed. They thought maybe the occupation will continue in a way that would be more, humane. Maybe they will just scare people a little bit, and then they occupy some strategic objects, but they wouldn't hurt civilians. And then it became clear that civilians are targeted, specifically residential areas where there is nothing, no bridges, no plants, like nothing that could look industrial or strategic. So these people are fleeing. Then the other areas of Ukraine got affected. Those people started moving. Now there is huge traffic on the roads. People don't know which roads are safe, when the airstrike is going to happen, but they're still coming, they're still leaving. And then they crossed I have so many friends, so many people I worked with, collaborated on projects that didn't leave right away. Then they had to get on these trains where they would stand to get from Kharkiv to Lviv, which is from the east to the west. They had to stand like this on a train for 20 hours. Some with children, some without children, but that's what happened. And then they arrived to Lviv, and they don't know where to go because there are thousands of people on the platform. There are some evacuation trains that would take people to Hungary or to Slovakia or to Poland, but again, they don't know what's next. All they want to do is just run away from being physically destroyed. And then the fun begins. You come, maybe some volunteers offer you some place to stay for a few nights, but then you don't know where to go next, what to do, who offers any financial support, any programs. There are rumors, people with more resources, they get it a little easier. People who are more vulnerable, they get it harder. It's a nightmare, I would say. But just to step back a little bit, since we talk about Ukraine, I just want to talk a little bit about what Ukraine is about. Right now, yes, we have about 3 million refugees and maybe more, but these are the people that were sort of in the background. Nobody talked about them. Who are these people? Identity, it's a question that, you know, it's more like abstract and theoretical question that right now, when there are pressing needs to help people who are really either dying or hungry or don't know where to stay, it seems almost like a luxury to talk about identity. But at the same time, it is important because there is still the Russian leader who comes out on very powerful media channels and lies blatantly, looking into other leaders' eyes. He says things that are simply not true. There is absolutely no reason at this point to argue with his point of view on history or who Ukrainians are. He's been saying that 20 years ago when he came to power. He's been saying it in 2014 when Ukrainians became more democratic and ousted the president Yanukovych, who fled to Russia. And he keeps saying the same things. And his supporters, or these, you know, I don't know how to call them, the experts that are the propaganda basically voices, they just say the same things with different variations. But what's important to remember that Ukraine is a country, it's a nation. Right now it's about 40 million people. It's not 5, it's not 10 million, it's not even 13 or 15. It's actually a quite sizable country. And it used to be a little larger, but because of the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and eastern side of Ukraine, Donbass, it's a mining area, it lost a few millions, but right now we say roughly 40 million people with different regions. And like any country that is a good size, it's very diverse. And of course, culturally, some regions are different, some dialects are different. It's a big country, it's a diverse country. And unfortunately, for years, it was also, for centuries, it was also under different rules. One part was under Austria-Hungarian Empire, the other part was under Tsar, and Russia, even 2 or 3 centuries ago, put a lot of effort into killing Ukrainian identity. We can, you know, talk about history and reasons why they did it, but the bottom line is, today it's a country that really doesn't want to be with anything that Russia represents. And these are the efforts by Vladimir Putin and his government. If Russia, for some reason, today would have been a democratic country with a lot of liberties, with opportunities, with no, you know, not the police state as it is becoming or has become now, I'm pretty sure that there would be a lot of collaborations and friendships, but it's not the case at this point. It all ended in 2014, even for the eastern part of Ukraine that traditionally was more inclined to have collaborations and ties with Russia. But since 2014, it changed. Because when someone comes and occupies your territories, a lot of people, they wake up to that and they start thinking, why? We don't want that here. We want, you know, whatever they wanted to do at that time. It was a little bit more lighthearted after the Maidan revolution, when we thought that 100 people died in a couple of days during the protests, and that was a big loss. Right now, the loss is much bigger, and even those who were maybe on the fence, maybe they didn't really think too much about West or East, they were comfortable with Russia. Even those people, when your house gets bombed, when your neighbor dies, when your mama dies, when, you know, your family gets destroyed, you clearly see this is absolutely not a brotherly nation. And just because somehow genetically it is possible that, you know, all Slavs come from the same area, it doesn't mean that, you know, you're gonna be friends or you're gonna come back to this abuser, to this really harsh regime. So I would say that Ukrainian identity definitely changed over the past 30 years. It was sort of kind of on the fence for a while. The western part of Ukraine was closer, and it was also, it joined the Soviet Union much later, so they didn't have that much time to change. So national identity was a little stronger, but pretty much everywhere in the Soviet Union, it was all Russified, it was all sort of changed into more Soviet people. In Belarus, in any republic that now is an independent country, Russian language was dominant, school programs were identical, school uniforms were identical, so they would breed a Soviet person from a very, very early age, from kindergarten. So I don't want to talk much about it, I just want to explain that because for 70 years, all these republics, including Ukraine, were oppressed in many ways. when the Soviet Union collapsed, not every country came out with a very strong identity right away. And since Ukraine was sort of like, okay, there was no war, you didn't have to defend anything, people were fine with being close to Russia, with traveling back and forth, with doing business with Russia. When in 2004, Ukraine had their first revolution, Orange Revolution, when pro-Russian candidate did not win, and Moscow presumably tried to poison pro-Western candidate Yushchenko. I think that's when it became clear that Ukraine is going in some other direction. Ukrainian people really truly wanted to be in a society that is not run by a strong leader. There's no worship of a strong leader. I know, I have a lot of friends from Russia. I have a lot of friends who came here from Russia, just like some of you. And I still hear that people would say, but if not Putin, then who else? But Ukraine never needed Putin. All Ukraine needed just some order, just leave them alone, and then they start growing their businesses, building their houses, and doing things in a Western way. Not everybody. Believe me, there was still corruption, people still wanted to do some deals, but most people, they just wanted to work and develop their own little unit of whatever they were, society, business, family, something. And worshiping a leader has never been a Ukrainian thing. And as I was very reluctant to really say these kinds of things for a while, but as time goes by, I see that it's probably somewhere in Ukrainian DNA, and also historically, the way Ukraine was organized with Zaporizhia and Cossacks. It was not about just one person who would dominate and lead everyone. So between Orange Revolution and Maidan Revolution, even though Russia definitely tried to oppress Ukraine in many ways, and also there was a huge information war through media channels, and there would be all these things about languages and culture and history. I don't think it was enough to sway Ukrainians to forget that they wanted to be a different kind of society. I don't think there was enough oppression. I know that in Moscow or in St. Petersburg, after Putin re-elected himself in 2011, a lot of people went out and they were protesting, but also hundreds of them were thrown to jail and prison and stayed there. That's a pretty brutal way to show that I'm the boss and you cannot, to create a lot of fear in the society. Ukrainian leaders did not have that. They just were not designed like that. They're not former KGB people. Maybe they're also less organized. They were more about stealing and creating their personal wealth, but there was no strategic policy about how to oppress the society, how to tighten the screws. So the society was growing. There is another thing about Ukraine that I think is very important. It's Ukrainian diaspora. Because of Ukrainian problems for centuries, there were huge waves of Ukrainian immigrants coming to Canada and to America and maybe somewhere in Europe, but mostly they congregated in these two countries, Canada and the United States. And after 1991, when Ukraine became independent, a lot of Ukrainians, I grew up in the Soviet Union and in post-Soviet Ukraine, we had no idea that there were so many Ukrainians who just waited for the Soviet Union to collapse and come back and start rebuilding the country and bring something that they learned in the West, the wealth, the skills, the expertise, not just start a business and bring computers or whatever, some vodka and sell it back and forth, but actually make a difference in the country. So that affected, I think, the way Ukraine developed and grew over the past 30 years, because there are a lot of ties, cultural ties, and a lot of help and a lot of support from the West to Ukraine. So, any questions?
Thank you, Katya. Lev.
Sure. So I'll keep it short. I have to confess that the last 3 weeks have been quite trying, because growing up, I sort of come from this from three perspectives. One, I'm the first in my family to have been born outside of Kherson, which is also an eastern Ukrainian city. While in Moscow, I was mainly a neighborhood Jew. In Kherson, I was a neighborhood Muscovite. So it's a very strange thing to emotionally experience this again. And I want to really share sort of 3 points I want to get across. One is, why do I care? to why should you care, and lastly, what I think has to be done. So I care because my ancestors were bought and brought to Kherson in 1757. We settled the region. We developed the infrastructure, the agriculture, we engaged in trade, lots of other things. Some of them stayed in the Pale of Settlement, others moved into the city. All of my ancestors are buried in Kherson. My mom and I are slated to be the first ones not to be buried in that land, with exception of those who died in the Holocaust. My grandma had a life partner who was one of 14 kids, and only 10 survived Golodomor, that mainly people in the West are just becoming familiar with, which was yet another example of genocide in the Ukrainian region. And when I think of identity, Ukraine is not Ukrainians. There is no generic type. It's all these clusters of people with identities, histories, and personal attachments. And in the last 3 weeks, I got reconnected in many respects with the people I grew up with. You know, we didn't have diapers growing up in 1982. The Soviet Union was going downhill. And, you know, the way I was raised was in the backyard on Tavrichisky with my next door neighbor who, you know, essentially a naked baby sitting in the dirt. And, you know, and we stayed in touch casually over the years, and he's a successful deep oil drills guy who was out in the UAE, and I called him and I said, hey, you should probably get your mother out. He says, well, the mother won't go. And I also have a tough 73-year-old who just will not budge. And I said, well, what are you doing? He's like, well, she's arming. She's arming. She's getting ready for the Russians to come. And I said, what are you going to do? Well, I'm going to try to get my daughters out. And we got his daughters out to Germany. But I'm going to go and sit side by side with her and get ready to fight, which is exactly what they've done. And so all of a sudden, you're back in that childhood. You're back into that narrative. And I didn't expect it, because it really does hit home, because my mom now lives and breathes us every day. We try to reach out to all of them every single day. Kherson had the unfortunate distinction of being the first city to officially be captured by Russia. But they're fighting back every day. The occupiers come in. By night, they're forced out. And every day, civilians are the ones who are stalling the Russian war machine, and they're fighting. I mean, they're fighting literally with Molotov cocktails we've heard about, but they're fighting with pickled goods. And I used to pickle stuff with my grandmother, so I can totally see it. And in my favorite interview, I don't know if you saw this, that, I don't know, brought me to tears when they said to her grandmother, we heard you took down a Russian chopper with a jar of pickles. She said they weren't pickles, those were pickled tomatoes. But this is why we're here. We wouldn't be having this conversation if the war went exactly the way Putin planned it, which was the Russian-speaking part, which Kherson is a part of, would have splintered off and welcomed them as liberators. People were happy to be Russian-speaking Ukrainians in Ukraine. They did not need to become Russian citizens of that glorious empire. And that is becoming incredibly obvious. And I'm grateful to all of them who are laying down their lives so we can understand what Ukraine is about, what Eastern Europe is about, and the way forward. So why do you should care about it as an average American, or not so average American, or above average American? Because the United States has an obligation to Ukraine. And I know it's not legally binding, but the Budapest Memorandum is still in place, because after the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had more nuclear warheads than Russia. And we promised them, mind you, non-binding, all this stuff, we promised them, United States, United Kingdom, and Russia, said, give up your nuclear arsenal and we will guarantee your territorial integrity and sovereignty. Now, I'd like to believe there was no intentional malice, because frankly, the actors around the table, the prime ministers and presidents, I think had good intentions, that they can trust one another because of the deep historic ties, because we are all P5 countries at the United Nations. We wouldn't possibly be the aggressors. And lo and behold, I think we were gullible. There should have been a formal treaty. We should have had a formal legal obligation to protect Ukraine, because the message we're sending now is that if you don't have a nuke, you don't have an independent state. And if that doesn't scare you, it scares me. It sincerely scares me. I am deeply committed to strong national defense, but I'm also committed to nuclear non-proliferation. And if you care about nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, this should scare you, because that is the message we're sending by not fully engaging in supporting Ukraine, not just diplomatically and financially, but increasingly so militarily. In my opinion, what should be done, especially with respect to Russia, are really three things. Russia must be first isolated. And I have to applaud Secretary Blinken and President Biden for driving forward a Western coalition like we haven't seen since the Second World War, to slowly build up momentum and get ahead of Russian intelligence by spilling their intelligence and their plans to the whole world so we can stand united. That's number one. Russia must be isolated. Secondly, it must be defeated. This may come to blows, and none of us in here want a third world war. We're all afraid of it. But Russia must be defeated. If we can't stop Russia in Ukraine, we don't know what will come next, and I don't like the potential of where that's heading, whether it's in Europe or in Asia. And lastly, Russia must be disarmed. Again, when he's forced to the table, and the time will come only because ordinary Ukrainians have stood up to that regime, Russia will have to come to a negotiating table, and they should not be trusted with anything. They should be disarmed, brought back into compliance with certain recommendations and pacts that were signed in the Soviet era and the Russian era, because if we want to have a decent 21st century and make 2023 better than 2022 and a hell of a lot better than 2021, we have to be firm in our resolve and our demands that Russia must be disarmed.
Thank you. Okay, let me open it up for questions, comments. Yes, come on up to the mic.
Yeah, how you doing? I was hoping you mentioned the Budapest Memorandum. That's the number one reason that we should be concerned about this. I mean, he could push a button and we're all gone. But more than that, on a more granular level, how much of a role does our media play in how we navigate this narrative around Putin and his invasion in Ukraine? I mean, all you hear about is the fact that Ukraine wants to be part of NATO and NATO wants to be part of Ukraine. And the reality is, you know, economics has a lot to do with this. I mean, I understand like a fifth of the world's lithium and titanium and nickel is found in that part of the world, and we use a lot of consumer electronics. So Putin is not dumb. He wants the economics of this to work as well. In addition to I think we buy something like how much of millions of dollars of oil and gas from them is imported to the United States from that kind of region. Young people need to know this. This is their future. We're getting old, but they're going to inherit a world where next to China, we consume most of all the world's energy. So that's the thing that bothers me. You know, we hear about a lot of things around other things, but the narrative around economics is not being told enough in this.
So, first on the economic front, you're absolutely right to note the natural resources that Ukraine has, and Ukraine also supplies 20% of global grain, which shouldn't go unnoticed. So I'd say first and foremost, for the Ukrainian economy to work, it assumes either a peaceful existence in Ukraine or a successful occupation that allows for the agriculture and other sectors to exist. With respect to how do we deal with, I think, in terms of being told what Putin is not, of course, media is important. Flow of information is critical. But Putin has tried to find every possible reason to go in. None of them are real. I mean, first and foremost, I think it's important, and again, I'm going to restate, if the U.S. government's made it clear, Ukraine will determine and has the right to determine what their nation is, what their borders are. They have a right to determine whether they want to be in NATO or the EU. And again, Putin's made these assertions. NATO is moving into Ukraine. Not true. Well, the EU may be moving into Ukraine. Also not true. Well, U.S. is sponsoring biological weapons research on the border with Russia. Also not true. Now they're down to literally talking about family values and gay parades. None of this justifies an outright invasion of a member state of the United Nations. And I would just urge you to resist giving any credence to that kind of narrative, because the bottom line is they're in there with one objective, that is to destabilize the world and occupy free people.
Hello, my name is Dawn, and I am a Hunter student, part of the pre-law program, as well as JPU here at Roosevelt House. And I'm just learning a little bit about what goes on in the world, because as Americans, we tend to be very insulated and not really pay attention to geography too much. So I'm just going in this with a pair of fresh eyes as someone who's an American who had that privilege to not be as involved in world affairs as we should have been. I'm just a reflection of that. So I understand that China has been really quiet as what's been going on. Not just with the Ukraine, but basically specifically with Russia. The assumption is that China will support Russia in whatever Russia does. That's the assumption. But no one's really heard from China about expressing outrage, support. They've just been absolutely silent. So I understand that NATO was sort of formed because of the concern about Russia in the possible expansionism that they were thinking about. But yet Russia is one of the big five as far as vetoing certain things that happen, right? I mean, from what I understand, when the Ukraine came a week ago to plead their case and to ask for help, at the time, I believe that Russia was part of the committee that headed the yay or the nay on that for that month. And I know I may be confusing some of my committees. So I'm just unsure, like, with all the treaties and all the things that are going on in the world, not just with America, we're seemingly bypassing certain things in order to accommodate, like certain places in New York City. But how will that also be I'm sorry about the phone, about overtaking? I guess my question is, if we're changing rules and laws regarding, so sorry, I'm so sorry. Okay. We seem to be, with some parts of the world, we're jumping through hoops to get accommodations for the Ukraine. And I know the question was brought up before about, well, there are other nations that are also, where people are seeking asylum, are going through their own political, anarchy. I'm just trying to figure out, to get a grasp on all this. At the end of the day, is this all going to matter if we just speak out and say, okay, this is not a good thing? We're trying to avoid World War III. Great. And you talked about disarmament and isolating them, and that all sounds good. But with all it seems the bits and moving parts that are going on here, I'm getting confused as to whether Russia will actually be held accountable. Who's going to hold Russia accountable if both NATO and UN both seem to have their hands tied regarding certain sections that they have to go through, and about the human rights element at the UN as far as, recognizing sovereign states? I'm just trying to wrap my head around, how will Russia get to the point that they will have to answer, they will be disarmed? This sounds like it could take decades. This doesn't sound like something's going to disappear in 6 months or 6 years. So if Putin is gambling on this, what do we have in place to stop him?
Those are a bunch
Sorry
of great
about
questions.
rambling.
No, thank you, Don. I think what we should do is, in the interest of time, let's get all the questions, and then I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just say some closing words and answer your questions or comment on them, please.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm a Hunter student, human biology, and also I was a former Roosevelt House Girl Scout. I just wanted to say thank you for everything you talked about today. And I have just two very simple questions. So, one, okay, so we see that Ukrainians' identity is starting to, become dismantled by what's going on in Russia. So how can Ukraine rebuild its identity from here on out, even after the war? And two, what is your opinion on a potential no-fly zone that's coming out of the federal government? Because I know there's a lot of critiques about it, so I just wanted to ask, what would a no-fly zone look like, and what ramifications could it possibly have? What benefits could it have? Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much. That was my question, too.
Good afternoon. My name is Richard, and actually it's a suggestion, and I'm making the suggestion to both Tom and to Commissioner Castro, since they are representing the city. I was born and raised here, so I'm far from being a foreigner. I spent an hour on the phone with London earlier today, and I was hearing all of the things that are going on in their part of the world. They opened up a link within the last 72 hours, and over 100,000 people have offered housing to individuals that might be immigrating from the Ukraine. We've been hearing the same thing from Italy. We've been hearing the same thing from other countries, including Poland. I have a rabbi friend of mine who left on Saturday to go to Poland in the relief efforts. My suggestion is several things. One, that the no-fly zone, of course, is critical. Now, I know our government doesn't want it, but in honesty, I don't care what my government wants. I care about people. And if people are being harmed unnecessarily because our government can't stand up and say what's right is right, has a problem. And that's a voting booth issue. With regard to our city, the issue of vouchers, housing vouchers, there needs to be an expansion or some sort of I don't know, perhaps exception or a niche created so that individuals that are coming here can actually be housed, as opposed to having to go into the shelter system and wait for months and months and months to get a voucher. That's something that needs to be straightened out ASAP. And lastly, since you are talking with our elected representatives, whom I can reach out to too, they need to understand that the financial side of it is critically important. I see Schumer regularly. I see all of these individuals regularly, and it's rhetoric. Action, action.
Thank you. We're going to have to cut off the questions. I'm sorry. So you can stick around after if the panelists have time, but I did promise to finish. We're already at 3. So if you could each just take a minute or so to just make some concluding remarks. If you want, you don't have to. Let's just start here, Eleanor, and go down.
Thank you. So there's way too much on the table, and it's all very important. And so let's think about today as the beginning of the conversation, and let's have more of these. Do we need to educate Americans more about what where NATO comes from? What is NATO? Why is the Cold War security alliance still alive 30 years after the end of the Cold War? Maybe President Putin has answered that question for us in a certain way about the function of that security alliance, and maybe the Western Europeans have woken up to a certain reality that they may have sort of in the post-school era forgotten. I mean, we're seeing Finland, Sweden, historically neutral countries now come to the table. Germany, right? This is historical. So the point was, is this going to change things moving forward for years to come? Potentially, yes. But I started with it. I kind of want to end with it. I'm not a politician. I'm not elected to office. I don't have to make the hard decisions about the no-fly zones and all. It's really the Ukrainians that need to be at the center, right? So that's kind of behind the scenes. Does China matter? Absolutely. There's a lot we don't know. Historically, when we think about the Sino-Soviet history, when we think about the Cold War, when we think about post-90s, that relationship has an importance, but there's a kind of a tactical, a reactive mode that Beijing has employed historically. So there's a lot of us that we will learn moving ahead, and we will just have to keep having the conversations.
Thank you. Commissioner.
Well, thank you. There's been a lot of interest in supporting the families or people who might be coming over. I've gotten calls from everywhere, other commissioners, community organizations, individuals have reached out. I spoke about advocacy because I think that is the most critical thing people can do now. In particular, reaching out to your federal representatives, Senator Schumer, Senator Gillibrand. When the time comes, I know that New York City will be ready and prepare, not just city government, but New Yorkers to help people resettle in New York and support them. But the legislation or action at the federal level is critical. I want to highlight something that I hope I didn't confuse people about or buried in my remarks. Title 42, it's really critical. I'm really appreciative that the mayor has lent his voice and platform to TPS and now to ending Title 42. Title 42 was a policy created during the Trump administration that drastically limited asylum seekers here in the United States. That needs to end. And today, with Mayor Adams, we released a call to action for the federal government to end Title 42. please look it up. This does not just impact potential Ukrainian asylum seekers, but all asylum seekers that are looking to come to the United States, seeking relief from the crises that they're leaving their countries.
Thank you.
Is it on? Okay. I just want to say that this whole war made Ukrainian identity as strong as ever. And unless something goes completely wrong, and there would be years and years and years of killing Ukrainians, something that could constitute genocide or Holodomor, that was artificial hunger that Stalin had to do to kill Ukrainians. The spirit and national identity of Ukrainians is just extremely high and united right now. And that's great, and that's probably going to stay like this. But I like the conversation about this crisis to go to the Cold War and what happened after, because I think a lot of people, especially young people, just don't think about it, don't know much about it. And in this case, not to promote my film, but I think that watching it would be really helpful, because in 85 minutes, you would know everything you need to know about the Cold War, how they lived in the Soviet Union, and what happened after in Ukraine. It's not publicly available at this point online, but it's open for any kind of screenings or private conversations and screenings. So if anyone is interested to view or to talk about it, reach out to me, because I think it's important, and I'm happy to help.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, and I would like to help organize a film screening at Hunter here or at the Hunter main building. What I also want to just go back to for a second is what Elidor mentioned in the very beginning, the difference between myth and history. We want to talk in historical terms today as never, and yet myths are something that live much longer than history, and we are, of course, all under their spell to this day, including the myths of origin, including the myths of the Cold War, which were many. And this is also something that my own research is devoted to. Part of this mythology is, of course, Russia as the empire of evil in that previous sense of evil, as the empire of the communist evil, right? Very much deserved. And yet, as long as we can have conversations about one thing, about to what extent it actually helps us today, I am not sure if operating these mythic or mythological categories is something that is even relevant. It's very hard to kind of break away from them, and that's what we, after all, do on a daily basis, what we read about, what we teach, what we talk about with students, etc. But history has tragically moved on since that period. So it's this liminal transitional moment when new myths, of course, are being engendered and generated, and they will also live much longer. We should also be thinking about this. Also, well, I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thanks.
So I'll try to pick up on 2 points. Richard, I think you mentioned sponsoring families for resettlement and bringing them here on temporary. I think you're absolutely right. In the same spirit of the Kindertransport that saved millions of Jewish lives in the Second World War, there should be a faster way, especially when you know how to establish an identity of who needs help and you have the resources to bring them. I absolutely agree. On the no-fly zone that was mentioned, I would entirely support a partial no-fly zone for Western Ukraine. There are no Russian troops on the ground. We would not be a threat to their operation down below, and we would protect civilian lives from above.
Thank you. I just want to go back to Dawn's questions, because I feel like I would be remiss in not just clarifying that what she was referring to was the UN Security Council, that Russia is one of the 5 permanent members, which gives it a right to veto any resolution. And you may have seen in the last few weeks that it has used that veto, and that when the invasion actually occurred at that moment, it's a rotating presidency. Russia was the president of the council, which of course also was very limiting. So the UN has been somewhat paralyzed. And I know there's a frustration that I think we heard about what can we do. And I just want to also go back to the point about war crimes and crimes against humanity, because That's a relatively new form of accountability that we're still exploring. It also hasn't been impressively effective. But while we've been sitting here, I caught on CNN a news flash that a theater in Mariupol has been bombed by Russia, which had hundreds of people in it who were seeking refuge. That's a war crime. You know, that's a crime against humanity, targeting civilians. And so I think we just have to keep in mind the urgency of this. There's way too much to talk about in one short meeting, but I think we do see it as the beginning of a discussion, and we look forward to bringing you back to Roosevelt House to have more discussion, and hope you'll bring the discussion out into the community. And it's up to us, you know, as Americans, we're being asked by Ukraine to do very passionately and repeatedly, the whole world is being asked to do a no-fly zone. So we have to respond to that request, and I think it has to be discussed and considered thoughtfully, and we have to just keep that conversation going. So thanks again to Basil and everyone who put this event together, and we look forward to seeing you again soon at Roosevelt House.